Hi again, everyone. Just another video today. And as promised, we're finally going to have a look at Japanese printmaking. So, a lot of people who don't know me very well, who've maybe only met me from doing the workshops and things like that, might not know that I am actually interested in historical things outside of just military history. And actually, probably my biggest interest outside of military history is it's probably the history of art. Believe it or not, my parents can attest that we very often watch art documentaries together. My mum especially has passed on her love of the Dutch Impressionist movement to me as well. But something that I definitely am super interested in is Japanese art. Now, I can't really go into anything outside of Japanese printmaking, unfortunately, because I don't have any of the materials here to be able to do so. Might have a little quick mention of Japanese watercolors later, but for now, basically, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Ukiyo-e, which is Japanese woodblock printmaking. Not so much the history, just more a general kind of discussion about the different types and the development of them. Now, ukiyo-e is obviously a very old practice, and it's been around for quite some time. But it really came into its own as a medium in what's known as the Edo period, which is after the Japanese Warring States period of the 16th century, the unification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate. Basically, there was the kind of old adage is that there was an end to war. It's not strictly true. There were obviously rebellions and outbreaks. So, for example, the 47 Ronin incident, the Shimabara rebellion, other such small and other smaller incidents that are less known, obviously would have been problems during that time. So to say there was no conflict or war at all is a little bit disingenuous. But this certainly wasn't on the same scale as during the Sengoku Jidai, which is the Warring States period. And so because of that, there was a massive expansion of Japanese sort of homegrown Japanese culture. So a real sort of turn to ideas of mediums and cultural activities that were specific to Japan. And of course, one of these was ukiyo-e, woodblock printing. And the Japanese very much had their own artistic style, which dates back hundreds of years. Obviously, the Heian period is probably the most regarded in terms of art from Japanese history. So you're talking basically the sort of 9th to 12th century, roughly. But woodblock printmaking really became one of the mainstays in the Edo period, really the late Edo period. So we're talking about the 19th century. And through into the Meiji period, which is after the Meiji Restoration, when the shogunate was overthrown and the emperor put back into a position of power. Very much a figurehead, but getting besides the point here anyway. Now, the reason that ukiyo-e became so prominent in Japan was, A, because you had a newly urbanized populace, which was living in the big cities like Edo, which is now Tokyo, and Kyoto, and other places around Japan as well, of course, that were growing. More urbanization, more industry, and therefore there was a bit more wealth to throw around. But not so much so that the average Japanese citizen could afford, say, a classical watercolor, because obviously they were still very, rare and singular items, that you couldn't reproduce very easily. But ukiyo-e, which is obviously prints made from blocks of wood where the image is carved into the wood, was a way that everybody could basically own art for cheap, which I think is a really wonderful idea. It's very similar to how things like comic books and sort of pulp novels and that kind of thing spread in sort of like 1940s and 1950s America. It's a similar kind of idea of these sort of cheaper print books being available to people in a more simple to understand way that didn't necessarily require like an English literature degree to understand that kind of thing. But it's very similar. It's art for art's sake very much for appreciation, but also there's history involved in it as well. Sometimes it can be depictions of certain historical events. But yeah, they come in several forms, and that's kind of what I mostly want to talk about. Now, I actually, obviously, there are many sort of famous woodblock painters, so Yoshitoshi, Chikanobu, and obviously the most famous of all is Hokusai. Now, obviously, Hokusai famously painted his views of Mount Fuji, of which the Great Wave is probably the most famous work of Japanese art ever. Absolutely stunning. And amazingly, I actually own a Hokusai. But unfortunately, it has to be pointed out that in Hokusai's own words, it is one of the ones that he created before he was good. So this is actually from back when he was producing what I'm going to look at first in one of the first types of ukiyo-e that was produced, which is known as manga. Now, obviously we hear the term manga now, and what we're actually generally referring to when we use the term is Japanese comic books. So graphic novels, things like Dragon Ball, One Piece, Naruto, any of the kind of big famous sort of manga, but any of the more obscure ones as well. But the interesting thing is that the term manga actually just literally translates to random images. So the original manga were two-fold prints like this, which would have had a selection of semi-related images. So it could be flowers, nature, animals, that kind of thing. But it wasn't a book. It wasn't like a single scene. It was just a series of different images that were loosely related to each other. So it might just have, just like a picture of a quince, which is a type of flower, obviously, and then next to it would be a hollyhock, and then it would just say hollyhock, that kind of thing. Or it could be a series of different animals. It might not even be the same type of animal, so it might not all just be birds. It could be, different animals that are from a certain region. Now, this one is the only manga that I own, and this is from about 1850s or so. And it's actually a Yari drill manual. A Yari is a Japanese spear. So this actually shows the instructions on how to use a Japanese spear. And even famous printmakers like Hokusai, now obviously, but again, this is before Hokusai's prime, so he was not a particularly well-known ukiyo-e printmaker at the time. But he would have taken commissions for things like that. It wouldn't have just been, his own fancies all the time. There would have been things where he would have been asked to do certain prints. And especially when you're still making a name for yourself, you kind of have to do what the customers want and what's desired of you. Now, just to explain a little bit about how those prints are made, I'm going to look at one of the other types of prints next, which is the diptych, which is basically two sheets like you saw just there, put together, but it shows a single image. And this, obviously, anyone who's familiar with art will know what a diptych and a triptych are, but to give you an idea, I'll actually show you one of my collection of Chikanobu prints, who was a late 19th century printmaker who was remarkably talented, but is not one of the most well-known outside of Japan. He's definitely a favourite of mine. And this is his depiction of the fight of a samurai called Hasebe Nobutsura, who basically, a group of enemy samurai attacked his lord, and he was unarmed and had no armour, so he grabbed a ceremonial sword off the wall and basically tried to fight them off. It was 1 versus 100. They were all fully armoured, so what he did was he basically ran around the mansion that he was protecting, just sort of like guerrilla warfare style fighting them, and he managed to kill about 11 of them before he was captured. And when they pressed him and said they were going to put him in prison or execute him, he basically turned around and said, well, I've not actually done anything wrong, I just did what I was supposed to do to protect my lord. And so they let him off, which is a good story, but you can see the detailing there. Now, you can probably actually see that there's sort of like a limited colour palette to ukiyo-e prints, and that is predominantly because of the way that they're made, which effectively is that you'll take anywhere between 8 and 12, maybe even more, plates, which are wooden blocks, and each of those blocks would have a different part of the image carved into it. Now, what we've got to remember as well is because of the fact that this is print work, you're not actually carving the lines into the wood, as it were. So you're not just scratching the sort of outline of the image into it. You're actually carving everything around the line, which is significantly harder to do. But each one of those blocks would incorporate basically a different color. And what's done then is the block is placed down, and then a separate artist. So you have the actual person who makes the woodblock prints, like your Hokusais and guys like that, and then you have a separate artist who's the actual printmaker, whose job it would be to actually effectively paint the colours onto the wooden block, and then place the rice paper down and press it down and print it. And this actually required a huge amount of skill in and of itself. And it's a shame that those chaps actually don't have the same reputation as the guys who make the wooden blocks. Obviously, you don't really get the names for them. But as you can see, the actual technique that must be involved in that is remarkably advanced. The actual woodblock making, of course, is incredibly difficult. As you can see, the detail is remarkable for something that was carved by hand. And you can actually see one of the marks of truly great ukiyo-e is what they refer to as the gradations of colour. So rather than just being solid colours, you actually have it that they can print a sort of gradation of colour. So going from dark to light with a single colour. That is actually done by basically using very thin, sort of very watery paints that are very rich. And then they effectively sort of paint the solid colour down and then let it run. And then use a rice paste, so a paste made from rice, to draw the line at which that colour stops bleeding, effectively. So it's all very technical. Now, but again, both of these would be types of art that were just easily distributed and sold at local markets and things like that, and specialist sellers. So it was actually quite a cheap bit of art to own. Not anymore, of course. These old antiques can go for quite a reasonable amount of money, depending on the artist. Original Yoshitoshis, for example, can reach upwards of $6,000, which is a huge amount of money for a single triptych of art, only about that big. Fortunately, I don't own any of those, which is a shame. But the third type that we have is in book form. Now, this is actually a book which depicts the 47 Ronin incident that I mentioned earlier. So if I find it for you here, you actually have, what is normally done is that each of these books starts with a diptych, which is basic. So it's a folded one rather than a joined one of one of the main images from the story. So here we have when the samurai the Ronin take the severed head of their Lord Asano's killer and place it by Lord Asano's grave. If anyone's not familiar with the story of the 47 Ronin, if you're interested, please leave a comment and I'll happily make a video about it later if people want to know about it, because it is a very, very, very interesting story. But after that, basically you get a series of course, the actual writing of the story, written in Japanese, obviously. And then throughout you have dispersed other images from the story. Now, this one actually contains a second story, which you see depicted here. And yeah, so these were, again, not massively expensive things to own or to purchase. And this was basically like their version of history books, pretty much. So they would have been made with printmaking instead. And similarly, they would have had printing for the actual words, but they would have actually been done with sort of set type print, effectively, rather than carved individually for each different book, because obviously that would take years to produce a single book. But the images, of course, are individually printed. The final type that I want to just look at is portraiture, and this is slightly different to the diptych and triptych style that I showed previously, in that it just depicts a singular person from history, and is done on a single sheet of rice paper. Now, these now are very valuable, and they're quite difficult to get a hold of. And this is actually a Yoshitoshi, who is one of my favourite printmakers. He did a series of prints of famous samurai from history. And anyone who's chatted to me for any amount of time will know who this fellow is. This is Yoshitsune, who is my favourite samurai from Japanese history. And in fact, one of my favourite people from history in general. again, we'll be happy to do a video about him if you want to know, but this one's already getting a bit long anyway, so I'll cut it there. But you can see the immense amount of detail in the different colours. A good rule of thumb for sort of printmaking is the more colours there are, the more expensive it's going to be. And of course, the more famous the name that's attached. Now, those are the predominant sort of types of prints that you get. And it's interesting that obviously it's fairly plain to see how this art form has influenced modern Japanese art, from manga and anime to actual modern printmaking, which is making a comeback as it turns out. And there's some really awesome new printmakers who are coming about now that are worth looking into. But has also actually had an enormous impact on our own Western art. And so I didn't just mention the Dutch masters to show off my to be pretentious earlier. It was actually to feed into something that a lot of people don't necessarily know, which is the fact that Vincent van Gogh, probably easily the most famous Dutch impressionist painter, was heavily influenced by Japanese printmaking. He and his brother Theo had a collection I believe in the thousands of prints that he had imported from Japan, because he was fascinated by the sort of stark colour. And it was his window into the world of Japan. And actually, it's a really beautiful thing where when he spent some time in the south of France and the countryside there to try and get away from the city and be re-inspired by his art, he actually genuinely felt like he was in Japan. He saw the similarities and the sort of like the shared history and culture that we had. The sort of like the humble peasant, which appeared very often in Japanese art as well. He saw mirrored in the work that was being done by the farmers in the fields near where he was staying and painting. And at first, as you can see from the front here, he basically actually just copied Ukiyo-e. He actually just reproduced original Ukiyo-e prints, but it actually had a big influence on his actual art as well. So this is obviously an original Van Gogh, and in here you can see how he starts to kind of try and take those the sort of principles and disciplines of the line work in Ukiyo-e and apply them to his own painting. It's kind of difficult to explain because I'm not an expert art historian, unfortunately, as much as I'd like to be. But it's this book in particular, Van Gogh in Japan. If you want to learn more about the subject, it's really interesting. And obviously, it's kind of difficult to actually see what our modern sort of world of art in the West over here would be like without Van Gogh. And so similarly, by extension, it's very difficult to actually sort of appreciate what our world in general of art over here would be like if it wasn't for the impact of Japanese art. That little window that was given to Van Gogh through his collection there, which is a rather wonderful thought to have. But unfortunately, I'd love to be able to invite people over to come and have a look at my collection themselves. But of course, at the minute, we're not allowed to be seeing each other and stuff like that. So hopefully that's given you a little window into my collection. And I might post some more pictures of some of the ones that I have onto my Facebook page. But yeah, I hope you guys have found that interesting. I hope you've enjoyed it. And we'll see you in the next one. I'm not sure what the next video is going to be about, but keep your eyes open and we'll come up with something. Take care, stay safe, stay at home if you can, and keep washing your hands.